Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our RFF seminar at the American Chamber of Commerce about innovation and competitiveness in international taxation, and also about Portugal's strategic positioning. I would like first to take this opportunity to thank, on my name and on behalf of RFF Lawyers, for this kind invitation to organize this seminar together with AmCham. My name is Rogério. I'm the founder and the managing partner of RFF Lawyers, and I'm very happy to be here with you today. RFF is the first and the largest tax and business law firm boutique in Portugal. We started in 2012 with a strong focus in tax and business law, serving companies, investors, and families investing in Portugal or through Portugal to other jurisdictions. It is a pleasure to welcome you all here today, and you will hear from our senior lawyers, from our tax advisory, private clients, and tax litigation teams. We will connect tax policy with the practice. Just a quick note on timing. We'll run for about 1 hour. The slides and the references will also be shared with you at the end. And if you would like more detail, please speak with us at the end. Those who are online may also submit questions in the chat at the end. Let me now frame our panel with some thoughts on Portugal and its relevance in the international context. On simple terms, Portugal has a wonderful location and has also some interesting tax tools. Location first. Portugal sits on Europe's western edge, facing the Atlantic and looking to Africa and the Americas. We share time zone with London, Dublin, and Edinburgh for most of the year. It sounds simple, but matters for teams that work across regions and for investors who watch markets in real time, which is not so easy from Madrid, from Paris, or from Berlin. Flights are short to Europe's capitals, and to US coast is 6 to 7 hours. Connections to Africa are direct, and to Asia are straightforward via European or Dubai airports. Sines is a key port and is a gateway to Europe, and one of the few with capacity for expansion. And with the subsea cables connected to it, provides vital corridors between the US, Latin American countries, and Europe. All of this turns the geography into something practical, shorter connections and fewer time lag frictions when people and capital move. And if we add the Portuguese autonomous regions, the Madeira and the Açores, Portugal becomes a natural bridge between continents for trade and investment, and a platform for investment in or through Portugal to other jurisdictions. We also have a broad double tax treaty international network crossing all European countries, including all Lusophone African countries, the Americans, and all key Asian partners. As we all see today, Portugal is not a small country, is not one more dot on the map. And now the law. Everything we'll discuss in this seminar plays a fair game, and Portugal has a vigilant tax authority. Portugal is under EU law and the OECD standards, and is actively negotiating the UN Framework Convention in tax matters. This international law and framework are not simple decoration, but a cornerstone to the Portuguese international positioning. And although adjustments do occur every year, the tax regimes in Portugal are quite stable. In this current international tax contest, it is without a doubt that we must say that any structuring within the Portuguese tax regimes should be built on substance, with real people, with real functions, and with real companies and real decisions. And when the disputes arise, and they do, Portugal has an innovative and specialized forum, quite unique in tax controversy, the Tax Arbitration Portuguese Court in the CAD. Here, the proceedings are mostly written, the timeline is focused and generally quick, and the arbitration judges may quickly refer preliminary rulings to the European Court of Justice. Together, these perks of Portuguese tax legislation create predictability, reduce the risk of double taxation, and allow planning that survives contact within the real world. Now, the tax tools. Think of a current stack that runs from people to investors, to companies, to capital. In this panel, we will start with the people. The EFC regime, known as the NHR 2.0, supports skilled workers, high-profile investors, and entrepreneurs. In the case of relocation from outside of the European Union, from the US, any tax regime will only work if immigration and tax timelines are coordinated. So we will need to talk about the immigration routes that matter the most. And now the capital. We will also look at funds and at the venture capitals, with regimes designed for fund level neutrality. The exit taxation system is the basis for the Portuguese funds tax regime. Additionally, non-resident investors benefit from exemptions or reduced withholding, depending on the vehicle. And finally, the companies. We will connect the incentives to innovation, from R&D to IP income, from holding structures to investment vehicles. In the holding companies regime to Portugal as residence state, it is built on participation exemption for dividends and gains. And we will address the specific tax regime of Madeira as a licensed framework with a low tax rate, job link caps, and clear substance expectations. And why does Portugal work? The location of Portugal helps, but people, qualified professionals, and business environment makes a difference, combined with competitive tax regimes. So, the flow for today. Joanna, will set up the EFC, the scope, the routes, and the red flags, followed by Duarte with the visas and how to make the immigration and tax move together. Álvaro will speak on the design of tax incentives for R&D, IP income, and outline our fund tax regime. These regimes deliver positive outcome to companies and to investors. Marta will focus on the holding regime, what qualifies, what does not, and where the traps are. And Vania and I, at the end, we will close with some notes on tax disputes in Portugal, with our tax arbitration regime at CAD, and with an overview on the mutual agreement procedure on MAP and on international tax arbitration in Portugal. That is the frame for today, and we hope that you will enjoy our RFF seminar. So let's start. So with Joanna. Joanna, following our plan for today, can you walk us through the EFC regime? How does it work? And which are the main red flags, please?
Of course, Freddie. And it's a privilege to be here today, and thank you for your presence to share a few insights on a tax matter that is not only highly relevant, but also with real impact on high net worth individuals. And we'll get into the details in just a moment, but first, just a quick note. Many people have been calling this regime NHR 2.0, and personally, I think that's a bit misleading. And why? Because this is not just a rebrand
Desculpa.
Um,
Show must go on. Show must go
Let's
on.
go on. This is not just a rebranding of the old non-habitual residence regime. This new framework is much more targeted and strategic. In a way, it aims to attract qualified individuals. And so for the sake of clarity, I'll refer to it by its actual name, IFISI, and which stands for Tax Incentive Regime for Scientific Research and Innovation. Now, IFISI came into effect on January 1st, 2024, and it runs for 10 consecutive years, just like the former NHR. And it's important to highlight that this is a special tax regime, yes, but only applicable to tax residents, because these individuals are treated under such quality. And for instance, for the application of the double tax treaties in force between Portugal and all of the jurisdictions. So what are the main benefits of this new regime? And let me point out two big ones, and also very much in line with what the NHR used to offer. First, a flat 20% personal income tax rate on Portuguese sourced income from eligible professional activities. And second, and most important, an exemption on most of the foreign source income. And it sounds almost too good to be true, right? But it is really true. Of course, there are exceptions. And pension income, for example, is excluded from this tax exemption. And also, specific types of income that arise from tax havens can be hit with a higher tax rate of 35%. In what concerns other Portuguese sourced income, if not linked with those eligible activities within the IFISI, they will simply fall under the general PIT rules. So what is the purpose of all this and of this new regime? In simple terms, to attract highly qualified professionals and entrepreneurs, and especially in fields like innovation, scientific research, and technology. Now that we have framed the benefits, let's understand exactly who can access this regime. And to answer these questions, there are two sides to the eligibility test that we must consider: the individual and the employer. On the individual side, the applicant must be a Portuguese tax resident, not have been a resident in the previous 5 years, and must not have benefit from the former NHR or a similar special tax regime. So from a professional standpoint, this regime is selective. It targets people in areas such as scientific research, higher education, healthcare, like medical doctors, ICT, engineering, and also board-level positions in qualifying sectors. And here we have the novelty about this regime. It's not only about the person, it's also about the company they work for. So the activity must be carried out within an eligible Portuguese company as well. And how do we know which companies do qualify? To answer this question, think along these lines: certified startups, companies in sectors like industry, energy, construction, hospitality, ICT, finance, insurance, education, and healthcare. And also, depending on the eligibility path, in some cases, the academic qualifications of the individual also play a role. So this is also something to consider when thinking about accessing this regime. And now about the 10-year validity of the IFISI. It's important to note that this isn't a set and forget benefit. So each year, two things must hold true. The individual must still be earning income from eligible activities, and he still must be a tax resident in Portugal. If either of these conditions is not met, the benefits for that year are lost, though they can be restored in the following year if the conditions are again met. And because this regime is so recent, there are a few traps to be aware of. Regarding tax residency, some people might unknowingly trigger Portuguese residency years ago, and so if that is the case, that needs to be corrected before applying. Applications to the IFISI must be submitted by January 15 of the year following the tax residency in Portugal, so miss this and the benefit period is cut short. And income must be received in the relevant year, not just on paper. And finally, pension income and tax haven exposure remain risky areas. And to take these more concrete, to make this more concrete, sorry, let me give you an example. Let's imagine a US-based entrepreneur. He wants to move with his family to Portugal and set up a tech startup here in Portugal. And so the key tech steps would be to confirm that he hasn't been a resident in Portugal in the last 5 years, to incorporate a certified Portuguese startup, update his tax residency to Portugal, and take on a director's role, drawing a salary, which will be taxed at 20% under personal income tax, and also be subject to social security contributions. The startup itself could be set up directly in Portugal by this individual or through his existing foreign company. In that case, the dividends that are being paid, that are going to be paid from this company to the individual, would be exempted under the EFICI in Portugal. And depending on structuring, income flows between the two companies could even benefit from the participation exemption regime, extending tax benefits on the corporate level, as Marta will further explore and explain later. And so in the end, EFICI is not just about lowering taxes, it's about creating a framework that rewards qualified professionals and innovative businesses while giving Portugal a competitive edge. But as always, and finishing up my intervention, let's not forget that planning should go hand in hand with immigration compliance, as one without the other simply doesn't work.
That is a very good point, Joana. An impatriate regime needs coordination, and immigration and tax timelines should be aligned, of course. So, Duarte, could you please walk us through our main visa routes, please?
Will do. Good morning, everyone. Portugal, it's picking up on what Joana was saying. It's not only about the taxes, and it's not only about personal income tax. As of today, important to mention that Portugal still offers a non-wealth tax and non-inheritance tax jurisdiction, which is important to anyone planning on moving to Portugal. We have Portugal positioned ourselves as one of Europe's most attractive destinations for professionals and investors, thanks to a wide range of residency visas connected to entrepreneurship, innovation, and investment. These visa routes can and should be synchronized with tax residency and EFICI enrollment, allowing for a combined legal and tax strategy. But the key point is the right choice of visa depends on the professional profile, the income structure, the family situation, which means prior tax planning is essential, and which means it's not only choosing one residency authorization. Depending on the type of idea of any applicant of the visa, they can choose numerous options. Let's look at a couple of them. We have the V2 and the V3 that are directly compatible with the EFICI. The V2 supports entrepreneurs, freelancers, and startup founders. The V3 is for highly qualified professionals, so corporate executives, independent experts, with proof of qualification and a minimum salary threshold. These two are particularly strong when combined with the tax planning and the EFICI application. We still have our very own T7 visa, so our pension income visa, which is designed for individuals with passive or self-generated income, here included in a very broad definition of passive income. We have rents, we have the dividends, we have interest, we have capital gains, but we also have royalties. And more than that, it allows professional activity in Portugal. So someone can come to Portugal under the passive income, but they can work in Portugal. It's often the simplest entry point and is especially effective with the EFICI because of the foreign income tax expansion and because it allows working in Portugal. So they also need to match the criteria to work for the EFICI. We still have the Golden Visa, our very own investment residency authorization. So despite the branding name of Golden Visa, it is in fact a residency authorization. Everyone knows no longer accepted real estate investments. So nowadays, investment funds and cultural investment, not exactly an investment, it's a donation, but are very famous and very used, especially by Americans. It still requires minimal residence in Portugal, and it still counts for the permanent residency. And as of today, as minute or week or month, it still counts for citizenship. probably, again, everyone knows this is under Portugal Constitutional Court review. Now we will have to wait for this decision until further notice. But important to mention that today, no changes are predicted regarding permanent residency. And just as an example, was yesterday, if I'm not mistaken, announced in the UK, 30 years for permanent residency. So we still have a strong regimes to present to our investors and potential planning on living in Portugal. Then we have the startup visa, which is targeted for innovative entrepreneurs and requires endorsement by incubators, embedding applicants in Portuguese innovation ecosystem. We also have a digital nomad visa for remote workers. It's less aligned with the EFICI, but highly relevant for attracting global talents to Portugal. Important to mention that the citizenship legislation is currently under review. 5 years will pass to 10 or to 7, depending on the citizen in case, and no changes regarding the permanent residency so far. Important to mention, it was also under discussion a couple of months ago. Family reunification. All types of residency authorization in Portugal allow family reunification. What changed was the possibility of the family, so spouses, children, to apply directly to a residency authorization in Portugal. Nothing changed regarding family reunification visas. So anyone applying to D7, D8, D2, D3, the family can apply at the exact same time for a residency visa and then to a Portuguese residency authorization while already in Portugal. Important to also mention that family reunification residency authorization, so the one after the visa, allows working and or studying in Portugal. Trying to make here the bridge with the tax regimes and the residency visas. So the EFICI can be the bridge between the visa routes and the fiscal incentives. A couple of examples. Golden visa investor that incorporates a company and creates 10 jobs. This investor will have access to the golden visa while the workers themselves can have access to the EFICI, for example. A D2 or a D3 startup can also benefit from this. So the one that incorporates the company can have access to the residency authorization and the workers can potentially have access to the EFICI as well as the very own investor. We are also seeing a very strong trend of non-real estate investment funds tailored to golden visa applicants. So these are often linked to technology, green economy, venture capital, providing both residency benefits and a role in Portugal innovation-driven growth. Trying to synchronize everything. So everything works in sequence. So we need to have the tax, the income, and the business planning. Then we have the visa application before the Portuguese consulates. Then we have the residency authorization application before the Portuguese immigration authorities, the famous IMA. And then we have tax residency and the EFICI application. When everything is aligned correctly, this provides both mobility and tax advantages. Wrapping up, D2 and D3 are the most effective for entrepreneurs, startups, and highly qualified professionals. It's highly compatible with EFICI. D7 continues to be the simplest route, ideal for passive income earners. Golden visa remains the most flexible for investors and families. Family inclusion and early tax coordination are essential for long-term success. EFICI can and should be the central tool. It connects visa pathways with innovation projects, tax relief, and investment strategies. Less connected with EFICI, we still have the D8, so the digital nomad that still plays an important role in global talent attracting. Citizenship is currently under analysis, but permanent residency can be a good option.
So, and with the individuals and the talent routes covered by Duarte, it is also important to discuss our corporate tax regimes. So, Álvaro, could you please guide us on what Portugal has to offer in this regard, please?
Okay, thank you, Rogério. Good morning to everyone. So we discussed the talent attraction with Joana, the visa routes now with Duarte. So in this competitive European environment, we look at the tools on the corporate tax side at this moment. How Portugal treats R&D expenditure, how taxes resulting intangibles, and how we attract internationally mobile investments. To answer the question on how Portugal taxes R&D, we need to start with the CFID2, which remains our main corporate R&D tax incentive. In simple terms, the CFID2 is a tax credit. Companies recover part of their R&D investment by offsetting it against the corporate tax they need to pay. The credit has two components. One is a base rate of 32.5% and an incremental rate of 50% on the portion of R&D investment that exceeds what the company has invested in the previous 2 years. For small and medium-sized entities in the first 2 years, the base rate is increased to 47.5%, and any unused credit may be carried forward for up to 12 years. The regime applies to Portuguese companies and also to non-resident entities with a permanent establishment here in Portugal. Eligible R&D expenses include the core cost of carrying out research and development, for example, staff costs, equipment, certain fixed assets, and costs related to patents. Under the rules in force today, companies may benefit from the CFID through direct R&D investment or through some forms of indirect investment, but this is changing. At the end of last week, the government has proposed to the Parliament the end of some of the indirect routes, namely the CFID investment funds routes, starting in 2026, with a transitional window for contributions made by year-end. We'd say these changes move the regime toward a stronger focus on genuine R&D activity. Now, to introduce a bit of a policy discussion, I thought it would be interesting to note that the CFID2 has become highly material to companies and to Portugal. A recent evaluation of the CFID2 shows that since 2006, the number of applications has increased more than tenfold. The declared R&D expenditure has reached 2.5 billion in 2023, and this equates to circa 3.5% of the Portuguese GDP. And, importantly, for every euro of the tax incentive, the companies have invested 1.7 euros in additional private R&D, which is a strong multiplier effect that was shown by this evaluation. So these results confirm what we in the practice have already induced, that the CFID has helped attract major R&D hubs to Portugal, has supported job creation for highly qualified professionals, and has contributed to productivity gains. Looking ahead, the R&D incentive framework is clearly in a transitional point. Under the current rules, the CFID2 was due to end in 2025. That is why I chose this sunset image. It is the closing of one cycle, but also the possibility of a new beginning. Last week's government proposal that I mentioned earlier extends the CFID2 for one additional year until the end of 2026. So we can see that this is not a long-term solution, it is a bridge, giving time for the working group announced by the government in that same proposal to develop a proposal for the new future. So this opens a very natural debate. Should the CFID2 end in 2026 or after 2026? Well, this would be difficult to justify given the proven economic effects that the evaluation has shown. Should it continue as it is? It is possible, of course, but perhaps not ideal in a Pillar 2 context. Should we move towards a redesigned CFID3, more aligned with international accepted substance-based incentives? Globally, as minimum taxation rules advance, the incentives are shifting towards a real activity, real R&D teams, labs, engineers, and innovation being carried out locally. A future CFID aligned with these principles would remain relevant and quite competitive on the Portuguese setting. And this also because Portugal has already a strong story to tell in the Pillar 2 context, beyond tax. We have skilled engineering and scientific talent. We have a significantly lower wage than other Western European jurisdictions. We have strong universities and research centers and a predictable regulatory environment. So for companies looking for an Iberian or Western European innovation hub, Portugal is often the most cost-efficient option. A well-designed CFID3 could reinforce this option even further. It is also worth mentioning that Portugal is gradually reducing its standard corporate income tax rate. So it was 21% last year, it is 20% this year, 19% next year, up to 17% in 2028. This strengthens Portugal's positioning from a nominal tax perspective and complements innovation incentives framework. Now, turning to the taxation of the results from R&D, we have to speak about the patent box regime, which is very competitive in the European context. It allows an up to 85% exclusion on the net qualifying IP income. In practice, this means that the qualifying income can be taxed as low as 5% or even lower. The regime follows international nexus approach. This means that the benefit must correspond to the R&D carried out by the company. Eligible income includes patents, industrial designs, and importantly, the registered software copyrights. This is particularly attractive for technology, software as a service, gaming, and analytics businesses, where Portugal is already strong with the other regimes that Joanne has also mentioned. A final note on the tax regime for Portuguese investment funds. Since 2015, funds are taxed under an exit taxation model that Rogério has already mentioned. Most income at the fund level is exempt, and taxation occurs only at the level of the investor. The resident investors are generally subject to tax at 28% rate and 10% for venture capital funds. Non-resident investors usually benefit from full exemption on income taxation from Portuguese funds, except in the case of real estate funds where a final 10% withholding applies. This means that foreign investors have strong reasons to consider Portuguese fund structures. For US investors in particular, there is an extra step of coordinating with the US advisors to align with the US tax treatment. But the Portuguese regime in itself remains very competitive. Taken together, these regimes show that Portugal has a tax system that is attractive, credible, and increasingly aligned with international best practices, positioning the country as a good platform for innovation and for investment.
So thank you very much, Álvaro. So this investment cycle in R&D, I think it's clear. So now it's time to focus on corporate structures. So Marta, could you guide us into the Portuguese holding companies regime, please?
Of course, Freddy. Thank you. Yeah. And thank you all for joining us today for this panel discussion. From the policy frame highlighted in the beginning by Rogério to the investment incentives that were outlined by Álvaro, we move to other corporate platforms that are of relevance in Portugal, the Portuguese holding regime and the Madeira framework. In addition to the geostrategic aspects, Portugal also stands out from a tax perspective, offering a broad treaty network and being part of the MLI, that stands for multilateral instrument, being a treaty to implement tax treaty-related measures to prevent tax avoidance, which reinforces international standards and places real economic substance at the center of any structure. In short, Portugal combines a highly competitive tax regime for holdings by putting together the local participation exemption, our extensive treaty network, and EU and OECD compliance. Entering into the topic of the tax framework for holdings, our tax participation allows dividends received from subsidiary, as well as capital gains from the sale of that shareholding, to be excluded from Portuguese corporate income tax, provide some conditions that are quite flexible are met. For the purposes of the application of this regime, the subsidiary must be subject and not exempt from an income tax at a nominal rate that must correspond to at least 12%, and the subsidiary must not be resident in a blacklisted jurisdiction. Moving on, at this stage, it's important to understand why Portugal participation exemption is more attractive than in other European countries. And to answer to this question, we would point out 7 aspects. First, our participation exemption offers a broad scope, considering that the exemption applies both to dividends and capital gains, being the conditions quite simple: a minimum of 10% shareholding held for at least 12 months. Secondly, there's no minimum acquisition value. Unlike other countries that impose a minimum acquisition cost or investment threshold, Portugal only requires a qualifying percentage and a minimum holding period, making it more accessible for mid-sized structures. Thirdly, our participation exemption has a wide geographic reach, since it can apply not only to EU subsidiaries, including Portuguese ones,
but also to entities outside the EU resident in treaty jurisdictions, provided said entities are not listed tax haven and meet certain substance requirements in line with the case law of the European Court of Justice. This gives Portuguese holdings companies a broader international scope and enables an inbound relief in situations where EU directives do not apply. Fourthly, regarding capital gains flexibility, the exemption extends to capital gains on the disposal of shares without imposing restrictive conditions. There is only an exception for capital gains derived from the sale of shares involving Portuguese companies with significant real estate assets. Moreover, the regime provides for no withholding tax on outbound dividends, also under conditions in line with the parent subsidiary directive. As a result, dividends paid by a Portuguese holding to shareholders in the EU or tax treaty jurisdiction are often exempt from withholding tax or subject to reduced rates, making Portugal efficient not only on inbound but also on outbound flows. And lastly, two final references. The first one, to recall that Portugal fully complies with the EU directives, namely the Interest and Royalty Directive, enabling the elimination of the withholding tax on this type of cross-border payments between associated companies in different EU member states. And unlike other countries, Portugal has not introduced excessive gold plating conditions that complicate the access to the exemptions. And the second point, Aldo has an introduction for the next topic, to note that for companies established under the special Madeira regime, effective tax rates can be further reduced, making Portugal stand out even more compared to high tax jurisdictions. To wrap up, the Portuguese participation exemption combined with a broad treaty network is extremely relevant when structuring EU platforms for Latin America, Africa, and Asia, where EU directives do not apply. In short, and going back to the previous presentations, Portugal can be used not only as a destination for residents from a personal standpoint, but also as a platform to invest in other countries from a corporate perspective. And now I will give the word to Álvaro that will outline the main concerns that should be taken in consideration in a holding structure connected to Portugal. Sorry.
Thank you, Marta. So this is indeed a very important point, because when setting up a holding structure in Portugal, and this we are thinking of both a top holding or mid-level holding, there are a few practical aspects that companies must need to keep in mind. So let me start with something very practical. When Portugal applies reduced withholding tax rates or exemptions on outbound payments, the tax authorities expect a certain level of documentation. In practice, this means having the right forms in place and, importantly, obtaining and keeping tax residency certificates from the foreign shareholder before making payments that benefit from a reduced treaty rate or a EU directive. This is a basic compliance step, one that us and the courts tend to understand that the law does not impose, but it is essential to avoid having this discussion with the tax authorities. A second point relates to the participation exemption regime that Marta has already explained. Although very beneficial, this regime comes with anti-abuse conditions. In simple terms, the structure must have genuine economic reasons and real substance, meaning real functions, real decision-making, and activity, rather than a mere formal arrangement. For outbound dividends, the authorities pay close attention to the beneficial ownership, essentially whether the entity receiving the income is the one that truly controls and benefits from that income. Also, importantly, whether the entity receiving the income is a subject to tax entity. This is an area where Portuguese and European case law has become increasingly relevant, and we see that the tax authorities are looking much more closely at this in practice. What does this mean to the companies? It means that when designing the international structure involving Portugal, it is important to take a thoughtful approach to substance, to functions, and to the flow of income between the entities. This does not need to be burdensome. In fact, it can be turned into something as an advantage. Why? Because thinking about the substance early allows the group to build a structure that is robust, defensible, and aligned with international best practices and expectations right from the outset. Overall, Portugal offers a very competitive holding regime, but like any modern system, it works best when companies combine the tax benefits with clear governance, proper documentation, and real business substance.
Thank you very much, Álvaro. So we now have to move to other special tax regimes, namely Madeira tax regime. So could you take us and our audience there, please, Álvaro?
Sure, Rogério. So let's all travel a bit, at least conceptually, to Madeira. So Madeira is a remarkable island in the Atlantic, and importantly for today's discussion, it is classified as an outermost region under the EU treaties. The statute allowed Madeira to operate special regimes that wouldn't be possible elsewhere in mainland Portugal. These regimes have created a very distinctive value proposition for international businesses. There are two main regimes. One of them, I will only mention briefly, the Industrial Free Trade Zone. It applies to a defined list of industrial and manufacturing activities, and it offers an effective corporate income tax rate of 2.5% on eligible income. It is also the only Madeira regime that can be used in combination with operations in mainland Portugal. The second regime, and the one most relevant for international businesses and investors, is the International Business Center of Madeira, and most commonly referred to as the Madeira Free Trade Zone. For the International Business Center of Madeira, under the legislation currently in force, the new licenses may be issued until 31st of December of 2026, and companies may operate under the regime until 2028. In the context of the Portuguese state budget discussions, there is a proposal now on the table to extend the effects of this regime up to 2033, which, if approved, would provide a much longer time horizon and a far greater planning opportunity for certain investors. Now to the key advantages. The companies licensed under this regime may benefit from a 5% corporate income tax rate on qualifying profits. These qualifying profits are generally linked to international activities, income earned abroad, but importantly, this income must be attributable to a real entrepreneurial structure located in Madeira. If the company earns income that does not fall within the scope of the license regime, then the Madeira standard corporate income tax rate applies. But the standard rate is 14% and will be lower in the coming years. The Madeira normal corporate income tax rate is then, of course, very competitive in the EU, even outside these special regimes. A very relevant point for foreign investors. Non-resident shareholders, provided that they are not resident in a blacklisted jurisdiction for Portuguese purposes, may benefit from withholding tax exemption on dividends distributed from profits that benefited from the regime. This is a major advantage, of course, for cross-border investment and is a strong differentiator when compared with other EU holding locations. Accessing the regime requires satisfying substance requirements, and there are two routes to eligibility. Route 1 is the creation of 1 to 5 jobs in Madeira within the first 6 months of activity and make a 75k investment in tangible or intangible fixed assets within the first 2 years. There is an ongoing discussion with the tax authorities as to whether these investments must be physically located in Madeira or simply allocated to the Madeira entity. But in any case, the investment needs to support the local activity. The route 2 is the creation of 6 or more jobs in the first 6 months of activity and without the need of a minimum investment. In both routes, the job creation must be measured in annual work units, meaning that, for example, part-time workers count only as a fraction of a job post. And as a rule, only employees who are tax residents in Madeira count for these purposes. The benefits of the regime are also subject to ceilings, which depend on the number of the jobs created. There are additional overall limits aligned with the EU state rules, namely with the block exemption regulations. All these elements illustrate a core point. While Madeira offers exceptionally attractive tax rates, the regime requires economic substance, proper implementation, and ongoing compliance. It is not a set and forget regime. And with that, Marta, perhaps you can continue by sharing your perspective on the substance requirements and the EU law compatibility.
Of course. Thank you, Álvaro. Going back to your introduction, the need to comply with economic substance requirements was reinforced by European Commission's announcement in July 2018, when in-depth investigations into tax exemption granted to some companies operating in Madeira began. The aim of the European Commission was to determine whether some of the conditions set out for the approval of the extension of the Madeira regime under EU state aid rules were being properly respected. More specifically, the European Commission questioned the compliance of the following requirements. If the profits subject to income tax reductions were sourced exclusively in Madeira, and if the companies receiving the benefits were creating and maintaining jobs in Madeira. Despite the existence of litigation derived from the non-compliance of said requirements, the European Commission's investigation did not challenge the existence of the special tax regime itself, as its sole purpose was to verify the compliance with economic substance requirements. This means that, provided said economic substance requirements are met, the regime is compatible with the Treaty on the Function of the European Union.
And we'll now move on to our next intervention. It is my pleasure to hand over to Vania. Who will speak about the Portuguese tax arbitration regime and its relevance in the international context. So please, Vania.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. We all know that in life we are only two certainties, death and taxes. So, and for us, all of us in this field, there are actually a third one. Tax disputes can take a very, very long time, at least in Portugal. So today I would like to share with you a regime that it's the exception to this rule, a regime that is fast, that is reliable and investor friendly. I'm talking about the Portuguese tax regime. Let me highlight here two features that make it stand out. First, swiftness, as decisions are delivered within 6 months. Second, direct access to the European Court of Justice. So what exactly is this regime? It is basically a voluntary alternative to the court litigation. So if a taxpayer wants to avoid spending years waiting in a Portuguese judicial tax court, they can simply choose arbitration. In Portugal, arbitration covers tax assessments, self-assessments, and withholding taxes. Although there are limitations. Criminal tax offenses and assessments and related to taxes are excluded. Nevertheless, for most cross-border disputes, this is a real working option. Let us now turn to how it works. The procedure is very, very straightforward. Cases are decided by panels of 1 or 3 arbitrators, renowned specialists in tax law, often professors, lawyers, and judges. Court fees are determined by a fixed fee schedule, providing cost predictability. And here is the crucial point. Final decisions are binding and enforceable on the same terms as judicial decisions, which means these are not mere advisory opinions or friendly recommendations. For foreign investors, it means certainty. Once an arbitral decision is issued, the matter is closed. Now let's talk about swiftness. By law, the arbitral court must deliver a decision within 6 months. 6 months can be considered a blink of an eye in tax litigation. Extensions are possible, but only in exceptional circumstances and limited to a year. Notwithstanding, most decisions come faster than 6 months. The average is around 4. Comparing with many European jurisdictions, the final decisions can take several years. Investors in Portugal are often truly surprised at how quickly the arbitration delivers results. It is therefore safe to say that while the Portuguese sunshine may take time to tan you, the Portuguese arbitration regime won't take long to resolve your tax dispute. Now, let me share with you the feature that truly makes Portugal stand out in this matter. Under EU law, Portuguese arbitral courts are recognized as courts for the purpose of the Treaty on Functioning of the EU. This means they can make preliminary references directly to the European Court of Justice. Most arbitration regimes in Europe do not have this recognition. The result is powerful. Investors gain access to the highest EU court through arbitration. Portuguese decisions are aligned with EU law, especially relevant in VAT and cross-border taxation. Now, let me finish by emphasizing that Portugal offers a tax arbitration regime that is mature, efficient, and unique in Europe. It resolves tax disputes quickly, guarantees expertise, and opens a direct bridge to the European Court of Justice. Furthermore, for cross-border international disputes, we have other tools. The best person to explain them is Rogério.
Okay, so we'll now move very briefly and present you the Portuguese position on the international tax arbitration. Portugal's framework in this field is built on 4 instruments. The first instrument is our international network of double tax treaties. Portugal currently has 78 conventions signed, and each of them includes a clause providing for the Mutual Agreement Procedure, or MAP. This mechanism is designed to solve disputes that might generate transfer pricing or double taxation conflicts. The second instrument is the MLI, the OECD Multilateral Instrument. It modifies many existing Portuguese conventions signed with the other states and provides for international arbitration. Portugal had the opportunity to formulate its own options and reservations. Portugal decided to adopt the independent opinion model, where the arbitration panel issues a decision after analyzing the case, rather than the baseball model, where the panel chooses between the positions of the 2 states. Portugal also extended the time limit before arbitration can begin. Instead of the standard 2 years, international tax arbitration can only start after 3 years without an agreement between the tax authorities. In addition, Portugal placed limits on the types of disputes that may be taken to international arbitration. Cases involving income that is exempted or not taxed in one country, application of domestic anti-abuse rules, or situations where a final court decision or a serious penalty has already been imposed are excluded. Finally, Portugal reserved that the MLI arbitration provisions only apply to cases presented after the instrument entered into force for both states, unless the tax authorities agree otherwise. So the third instrument in the EU is the EU Arbitration Convention of 1990, which applies to disputes on profit adjustments between associate companies in different member states where the arm's length principle has not been accepted. It provides for a mutual agreement procedure, the MAP, if necessary by international arbitration. And the fourth instrument, which is the Directive on Tax Dispute Resolution Mechanism, that was implemented in Portugal by a law of the Parliament in 2019. This law establishes binding arbitration whenever the MAP fails to reach an agreement within 2 years. From the date of the last notification accepting the claim, the clock starts ticking. If the dispute remains unsolved for 2 years, an advisory committee, or in some cases an alternative dispute resolution committee, can be set up to issue an opinion. And this opinion becomes binding if no agreement is reached within 6 months. So, in short, when we speak of international tax arbitration, Portugal relies mainly on these 4 international instruments: the double taxation treaties, the MLI, the Arbitration Convention and the EU directive. However, the tax arbitration instrument in Portugal has had very, very limited use. Just by the end of 2017, there were only 2 pending cases and 80 in the process of referral, most of them proposed by Italy. So Portuguese experience in international tax experience remains very limited, as most MAP cases have been settled so far by agreement and without the need for international arbitration. But Portugal recognizes international tax arbitration as an important last tool, especially in high complex international tax disputes, such as the valuation of intangibles, and this mechanism is expected to become in the future increasingly relevant as a tool for effective international dispute resolution. It is also worth mentioning the work of the Portuguese Commission for the revision of the tax procedure and taxpayers' guarantees of 2025, in which I was honored to be the president this year. This commission recommended the creation of a new chapter in Portuguese law, specifically devoted to the procedure for resolving international tax disputes, and suggested that Portugal should adopt clear domestic rules to govern the interaction between taxpayers and the tax administration at the initial stage when the request is filed and at the final stage when the result is implemented. So, in simple and in other words, Portugal recognizes that beyond the international instruments, we also need a solid domestic framework to provide legal certainty and competitiveness in this global tax environment. So, and with this, we have now reached the end of our seminar here at AmCham. It has been a privilege to share our perspectives with you. We truly appreciate this opportunity that AmCham has given us to reflect on the international positioning of Portugal, in fact, a small country on Europe's western edge, but one with creative regimes, tax regimes, a competitive business environment, and a natural role as a bridge between US and Europe. On behalf of RFF Lawyers, our sincere thank you to AmCham, and in particular to Engenheiro Martins da Costa and to Graça Didier for this invitation and for this organization. A special thanks to my colleagues and to RFF Lawyers and also to Inês for all the help. And of course, a special thank you for all of you for being here with us and for your attention. We hope that it has been useful for you. Thank you very much for your presence.